Welcome to the Salty Pastor Podcast. It is good to be back with you again, sitting in the Salty Pastor chair. I am Dr. Douglas Peak, and I am your humble Salty Pastor. Now, I just like to kind of return to this and let people, especially if those who are listening for the first time, is that the purpose of this podcast is to coach people in their faith. And I use that term specifically. And the reason why is because the majority of models used today in Christianity in America, not outside of America, I'm sure you'll find it some, but predominantly here in America is what I call a teaching model, not a coaching model. Now, when you do a deep dive in the New Testament on the word for teaching, it comes from the Greek word didaskalos, and it means to give, but it has a huge flavor to it. And then you compare it with the teaching model that is being used today in America when it comes to Christianity, you see a glaring difference between the two. Now, the primary reason for this is not an intentional type of thing. It's a philosophical development, and that is that at the beginning of the Renaissance in the 1500s, what happened is the expression of knowledge exploded. And so what happened is in Christianity as well, is it moved from a revelatory model to a knowledge-based model because of modernism. And basically at its core, I won't go into all the depth of it, but basically at its core, just simply this, is that the more you know, then the better you are. And in Christianity, the teaching model became very popular, and it was, sparked by some great preachers like G. Campbell Morgan, Charles Spurgeon, D.L. Moody, the list just goes on and on and on. And what their approach is that the more you know, in other words, knowledge is what makes you mature in the faith. Now, as you may know, at the Salty Pastor, we focus a lot on what you think and what you know. But the reason I'm a coach and not a teacher is because I don't believe that more knowledge actually matures you. It's what you do with that knowledge that will mature your faith. And therein lies the difference. Today, the vast majority of pastors, teachers, and preachers will tell you what you are supposed to do as a Christian. And the basic model goes like this. Well, the Bible says this, and then this is what you're supposed to do about it. And therefore, if you do what I say, the Bible says, you're going to grow in your faith. And so what I find in that is if you read closely the gospel message and what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, you find out that underlying approach is not accurate. And so you have to ask yourself the question, why isn't it accurate? And it really begs the question of why coaching is different than teaching in today's environment. And the reason why it's not accurate is because, first and foremost, that model assumes that there is a complete understanding of a standard of behavior. So, since Christianity's been around a long time, this is exactly how a Christian is supposed to behave. Therefore, if people just follow the standard of behavior, they are considered a mature Christian. Everything is good for them. Now, notice at the core of this, the unspoken premise. And the unspoken premise is this: the emphasis is on compliance. Now, when you read the book of Romans, you realize that this approach is exactly what he is criticizing about the Old Testament law. You see, in the book of Romans, Paul makes the argument that the law was a standard of behavior. All the Jews had to do was comply with it, and then everything would be fine. It would work out okay. Well, the entire gospel message is antithetical to this, primarily because no one could ever live up to or achieve the standard. And compliance in and at its core is not spiritual maturity. And yet today, so many models that are being used today to help people grow in their faith are ineffective Because at its core, there's an unspoken premise, and that is your spiritual maturity depends on your capacity to comply with whatever the standard might be. Now, another reason why I believe that this is not what the New Testament gospel teaches is because it puts all the work for spiritual maturity and growth on the shoulders of the follower. Now, if you remember last week, I was talking about the tragedy and the tragic things that have happened in my life, and I read from Psalms 41. And one of the things that I thought was so interesting about that psalm is that it points out that God is the one who lifted David out of the pit of destruction, the miry clay, and set his feet on new footsteps. If you look in the Old Testament, when God made a covenant with Abraham. Now, if you're familiar with Old Testament culture, people of that day were very common. They didn't have written contracts like we do. And so when they would want to make a contract, what they would do is they would take an animal and then they would basically saw it in two. And as it's bleeding, they would pull it apart. And then both parties would walk through the blood-soaked ground. And that was, a contract. It was a blood covenant. Well, what's interesting is that when God made a contract or a covenant with Abraham, what he did is Abraham cut the animal in two, pulled it apart, and then God caused Abraham to fall asleep. So he couldn't walk through the blood-soaked ground and make a covenant with God. So only God walked through the blood-soaked ground, you see. Now, because only God could make a covenant, because he knew that there's no way in heaven, don't you love that pun, Abraham or his descendants could ever live up to the covenant. So God made a covenant based on himself, not both parties. And so that's very important, is that who does the burden of spiritual maturity fall upon? Your shoulders? All of God's shoulders? Or is it your relationship together? I would postulate, and this is from other positions, but because of brevity, we need to keep moving forward. I would say that if at its core you think Christianity is to produce moral purity in you, then it's all falling on your shoulders. If at its core you can say if you're a moral purity type frame of mind, you could say, well, it doesn't matter what I do. And this is where universalism comes from. It doesn't matter what I do because God's going to save me anyway, so I'm just going to do whatever I want. Then you're putting it all on God, right? And you're saying that it has nothing to do with you. I would say that spiritual maturity doesn't all rely upon you. God is to will and to work in you for his good pleasure. God is to will and to work in you for his good pleasure. And so therefore, spiritual maturity is you and Jesus walking together and opening yourself up to his work in you. Okay? So that's very important. And the teaching model we use today seeks compliance, not this dynamic, interactive coaching relationship that should exist. So this is why the purpose of this podcast is to coach you up in your faith, right? By giving you accurate biblical truth. But what you do with that truth is up to you. I'm not here to tell you, right, what to do with this. I'm not trying to motivate you to apply these things in your life. If I do, then I become the developer of your faith. You are not the developer of your faith. If I try to tell you what to do or not to do, like what music to listen to, what movies you can watch, what clothes you should wear, what food you should eat, what politician to vote for, well, guess what? And then you listen to what I say, it's not your faith anymore. It's just simply an act of compliance to what I'm telling you to do. Now, that may, at its core, you'd say, well, it's because we trust you. Well, that's good. But what I'm trying to get you to say is, don't trust me, trust Jesus. Okay? Because at its core, I'm a human being and I am untrustworthy. Now, somebody's going to take that, clip it out, and they're probably going to run it on the internet and, misquote me. The point is that I am saved like you by grace, and therefore I want you to go to the well of grace. And I don't want you to get there through me. I want to stand on the sidelines and coach you and help you get to it yourself. And that is the difference. Now, this week, we want to continue and pick up where we left off at the beginning of the summer, and that is how in the world do you live a Christian life in a way that brings you the greatest amount of joy? And what I'm doing is not telling you what to do. I'm saying here are the principles. Now you need to do the work and figure out how to apply them. And what that does is it transforms your faith and gives you a level of maturity and experience that you may have never had in your life before. And early in the summer, we talked about topics like dealing with guilt and how you have to really do a deep dive, dig into, and resolve shame and guilt in your life. Your relationship with guilt has got to change if you want to grow to maturity. Now, we talked about living in courage and what exactly does it mean to live a courageous life each and every day, how to develop meaning in your life. And one of the things that I think is so important to talk about is let's remember our frame of reference. And I'm a person that has been studying a lot of Dr. Arthur Brooks, and he has some good things. He has some things that are, I'm not so sure about yet. But one of the things he does is brilliant is he gives us a framework, okay, a template for growing and developing happiness in life. And this is just based on hardcore research that he's done at Harvard University. Now, I want to show you again the video that we watched months ago as a reminder. Let's go. So there you have it. He says there are two main tracks if you want to have more joy in your life. And let's equate joy with spiritual maturity. I don't think that's a stretch. I think that's a very accurate relationship that we can conclude exists. If you want a more peaceful life, a more meaningful life, a more happy life, then grow your faith stronger. And he says that happiness in and of itself registers in what he calls the limbic part of the brain. And he says there are two aspects to it. It's just not one thing, but two, which I find fascinating. Number one, he says, focus on increasing the things that bring greater happiness in your life. He says faith, family, friends, and meaningful work. Now, notice how faith is number one. So the more mature you grow in your faith, then the greater potential for joy and happiness in your life each and every day. Number two, focus on decreasing the things that create unhappiness in your life. And so he talks in this particular clip about your health. One of the things that creates a lot of unhappiness in us is poor health, okay? And when you have poor health, it's really difficult to experience the happiness of faith, family, friends, and meaningful work when you feel terrible all the time. But I would expand that. What I would say is that you need to stop doing things that rob you of joy. Now, the primary factor, I would go so far as to say the number one thing that creates unhappiness in your life is not poor health, but it's wrong beliefs. That's right. Misconceptions about Jesus, about Christianity, about redemption, your nature, and salvation. And I totally get why, because I had a lot of these misconceptions for a very long time, even as a pastor when I was young. And that is that I thought originally that the purpose of Christianity was to produce moral purity within me, which changed. It was a misconception. It was a wrong target to shoot at. But because it seems like it's in the general direction of the gospel, then what happens is it's okay, because nobody complains about being a morally pure person, right? That's not who they lock up in jail. That's not who causes problems and drama at the office. Morally pure people tend to be really great people to be around, work with, and even count as friends. That's not the question. The question is, does it produce happiness in you because it is an accurate representation of the gospel? And what I would say is that this is one of the outgrowths of the teaching model being used in America today, is that it doesn't produce an accurate understanding of the gospel, right? And so what happens is, because of that, people can be Christians their whole life and never be happy, never be filled with joy. They miss out on that. They live constantly under a burden of they're not doing enough, they're not good enough, and so, but that's not what the gospel does. The gospel was meant to set you free from the law of sin and death, right? So you're supposed to be freed from that and walk in the fullness of joy. Jesus Christ said, I came that you would have an abundant life, have that life to the fullest. So we have to understand how this basic misconception does what? Gets us off track. And it's a belief. That's why I say the number one thing that creates unhappiness in life is wrong beliefs or misconceptions about Jesus, Christianity, redemption, your nature, and salvation. So one of the major misconceptions that I'd like to address has to do with what I've just been talking about. And that is, Christianity at its core is designed to produce moral purity within you. Now, why would I say that? Well, I have an example. I was reading a Bible study on 1 Corinthians. A lot of people do it. It's popular. It's well put together. It's very slick. And it comes with video and all this stuff. And some of it's pretty good. I don't want to say, oh, throw the baby out with the bathwater or anything. Some of it's pretty good. But I noticed that when they came to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, it's a study on the book of Corinthians. It's taught by a woman by the name of Jenny Allen. And when she came to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 1 through 13, she titled this section, Rooting Out Sin. And as I dug into this a little bit, I thought that's interesting that she interprets 1 Corinthians 5, 1 through 13 as the goal is to root out sin by holding one another accountable. So the emphasis is on accountability, right? And in her teaching, by focusing on accountability in order to root out sin, she creates a fatal interpretation flaw. And this fatal flaw produces a massive misconception about the point and purpose of Christianity or following Jesus. The flaw is this: she ignores the historical context in which this text was written. There's not so much an issue with what Paul wrote. He clearly says you need to root out the sin present in the church. That's clear, right? But if you ignore the historical context in which he said this, it makes it look like the role of the church is to focus on moral purity amongst its members, and that the goal of each Christian is not to encourage and inspire one another in faith, but it is to hold each other accountable to a morally pure standard and call it accountability. Well, this misconception becomes, a real significant negative in maturing faith. Because when you look at the historical context in which this was written, what you see is that the people in the church in Corinth had zero, and I mean no, moral compass whatsoever. Okay? They had people who were Christians in the church who were still sleeping with temple prostitutes. Okay? They had a man in the church that was living and sleeping with his dad's wife. Now, we're not saying it's his mother, it is probably a stepmother. And so, but he's living and sleeping with his dad's wife. And Paul specifically states, even pagans don't do that. And so his point is that right now there is zero moral compass in Corinth. So you need to root that out and get back on track. He says the point of his teaching is that this is egregious behavior. Therefore, the biblical principle is that there are things that are egregious behaviors that must be eliminated in order for the church to continue to be healthy. There's some egregious things when you first become a Christian that you probably ought to stop doing in order to begin growing your faith in Christ. What are some of those egregious things? Well, if you're running around sleeping with prostitutes, and if you're running around living with your dad, your stepmom, and having sex with her, if you're doing some of these things, you might ask yourself, maybe I need to kind of get my life back on track. If you have, if you're gambling your life away, if you have severe alcoholic issues that are destroying your life, you don't have to get rid of these things to become a Christian. But what you might say is that there's no way I can begin to have a relationship with God if I continue to worship these things in my life. So yeah, I probably need to do some. If you have hardcore drug addiction, you need to come to Christ and deal with those things immediately. And that's what Paul is saying. There's some egregious things that need to be resolved, okay? And everything else in between these, out of these egregious behaviors are fine, right? What do I mean by that? And why is this a fatal flaw? Well, because what happens is, if we say the goal is to root out sin, what happens when you root out all the big things, right? And like for instance, I knew a young man, okay, and he had a really tough childhood. He gets addicted to drugs, and he comes to this point. He says, we call it a come to Jesus moment, where he says, I need to get right with God. I need to get over drugs. Okay. Now it took him about 9 months to kick this habit, but he's been drug free, for decades, right? Well, then during that process, he had to deal with a lot of emotional issues and things that he believed contributed to his drug addiction. He was using drugs to medicate this, traumatic pain he had from childhood, and he got that. And so he starts working on that. And so then as he starts growing his faith years later, he's dealt with all these really, really big things. He's married and he has kids now, but he still walks around with all this guilt, right? And all this shame. And I was talking to him in particular, and I said, well, look, man, your life is so dramatically different. You got a great job, you're married, you have kids. I don't understand why you're so unhappy and depressed and filled with guilt and shame. And he goes, well, I dealt with the big stuff, but now I got to deal with all this stuff. Sometimes I have an anger issue, and sometimes I say things I shouldn't say, and I got to root out all the sin. And I'm like, who in the world gave you that idea? You see, that is why that misconception is damaging to joy and peace in faith. It's this underlying belief that we have to be perfect people when we become Christians, even though we know deep in our soul that will never, ever happen. And when we do that, we repudiate, I love that word, repudiate the point of the gospel. A perfect example of how this misconception works is this way, okay? Is in your car. Now, today, a lot of them have idiot lights, but they call them, but we used to have gauges, right? And one of the gauge is oil temperature, right? It has a little oil can on it, and it has down here, where it's cold. And then it has this range on it, right? And it's like 80% of the gauge has this range on it, and some of them have green lines under there. And if the needle is anywhere in that green line, you're fine. You're doing awesome. Your oil's great. Now, it could be really hot that day in the summertime, so it's running closer to the top. And then in the dead of winter, it runs closer to the bottom. But it doesn't really matter because guess what? It's in the right range. But on rare occasions, you can look down and you can see your oil temp way out of range at the very top, and it's hot, and that's dangerous. There's something wrong with your transmission. You need to get that checked. And so I think that the point of the gospel and the point of what Paul was saying is that, okay, you guys are kind of out of the range. You need to get back in. The point wasn't that there's one specific point and you have to be on that point or you're not a good Christian. You see, Paul was just simply saying, right now your gauge is off the charts, and it's going to have damage in your faith if you don't get it back within the range. This is very important, okay? This is very important to understand the difference because this is not a command instruction to spend your days going around rooting out all the sin in your life. Any perceived sin that you can imagine in other people, just like the church lady that goes around and says, well, you shouldn't be doing that. You shouldn't be wearing those clothes because they're not modest. You shouldn't be talking that way. You shouldn't be using that language. You shouldn't be seeing those movies. As a matter of fact, just recently, this is crazy, John Piper, well-respected Bible teacher and theologian, theologian. He came out with this thing saying that it's wrong to drink coffee in church. Oh, for crying out loud. It's getting ridiculous here. Paul says that we came to Christ to be free from the law and all these stupid rules, and we need to be able to live in freedom. He even says in Timothy, he goes, let no one, or is it Colossians? He says, let no one hold you captive to a feast day or a new moon or any of these customs. Whether you drink in church or not has nothing to do with whether you're a mature Christian or not, okay? Paul is simply saying, look, get rid of these egregious things that are way out of the tolerance, and the tolerance is really big when you are a person of faith. Now, why would I say this is so important? Well, let me give you an illustration in the world today that illustrates what happens in churches when you get askew. Okay. In 1960, there was systematic government-sanctioned racism in the form of Jim Crow laws in 3 or 4 states in the South. It wasn't across all states in the United States, just a few states in the South. This was wrong, right? The Civil Rights Act of 1964 corrected this injustice. However, today, 60 years later, there is a movement that states if you aren't working to create equity, which means an equal outcome for everybody, which is Marxism and is impossible and denies human nature, if you aren't working to create equity, equal outcomes, then you are still a racist. They call it the anti-racism movement. This, of course, is crazy. And it gets to the point where the movement now says that if you're white, you're a racist, whether you know it or not, simply because you're white. And that's because you experience this thing called white privilege. Do you see what happens is you have this egregious thing, and the goal is like, okay, we got to correct get rid of these Jim Crow laws that are wrong and unjust. And everybody knew that. Even the president of the United States knew that and sent the National Guard there to correct this injustice, right? Once it was corrected, boom. Okay, we're in the tolerance here. We should have all gone back to normal. But what's happening is this notion is that, well, there's only this very specific outcome, and anything that doesn't produce the exact same outcome in every people group has to be at its core racist. Therefore, racism still exists, even though there is no sanctioned government racism at all, has nothing to do with culture. It has everything to do with racism, and therefore we're going to go around and we're going to call people racist who aren't racist. And that's the same thing that's happening in the church today, is a lot of churches are going around calling people sinners and calling people wrong and pointing fingers and doing all this kind of crazy stuff because they have this same misconception about Christianity. I hope I'm making this point clear, because another example of this misconception is how we deal with teenagers and sexual purity. Churches often use terminologies like, say, well, we want you to stay pure, be pure, remain pure. And what they're doing is they're basically saying to kids is that don't have sex until you're married, which I'm in full support of. Don't get me wrong of that. What I'm saying, though, is that the way we approach it is not, God's best design is that you save yourself from marriage so you can experience the fullness of sexual pleasure in the context of marriage. We're not telling kids that. What we're telling kids that is that, well, you're impure or you're pure. And if you're impure, guess what? You failed. And that seems to me to create a lot of guilt and shame and a lot of craziness in the lives of young people. The impression young people get is this: if I maintain the standard, great, I'm pure. If I don't, then I am impure. And this is a repudiation of the gospel. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus specifically says that if you even look lustfully, it's the same as committing adultery. Now, what is he trying to say? Well, he's not trying to say that adultery and looking upon a woman lustfully is the same exact thing, the same act. No, he's not saying that at all. His point is this, is that no matter how hard you try, you may be able to comply on the outside, but inside you can never be pure, and therefore you're in need of redemption. Because the essence of the gospel is not to create moral purity, it's to create a gratitude for the redemption of God in our failure. Now, the first temptation when somebody grabs a hold of that understanding is this: well, what I do doesn't matter. Therefore, if it's all about redemption, then I can do whatever I want. This, of course, is not true at all. It is not true at all. Why? Well, because you are still thinking with the frame of reference of moral purity, but doing so in the opposite direction. The foundation of thinking is still moral purity is the goal of Christianity. Let me explain. If I'm thinking the goal of Christianity is moral purity, then I'm going to focus on rooting out all sin in my life. However, the more I try and once you get the big stuff out, then all the little things, man, it is really difficult to do. And I start to realize I can never be pure. So when someone says or comes along, hey, it's not about being morally pure, it's just about living in grace and being forgiven. If I still think in that frame of reference, then I'm going to conclude, well, it doesn't matter what I do. I can do anything, so I'm going to go do whatever I want to do. But Paul in Romans chapter 6, verse 1 says, do we go on sinning that grace might increase? Absolutely not. And that is a difference between moralism and living a gospel-centered life. Now, I'm going to leave it off, and we're going to pick this up on Thursday, dig a little bit deeper, but I hope it's helping you grow in your faith, because my goal is to coach you in how to accurately clarify your beliefs in a way that allow you to walk in the fullness and joy of every good thing that God has promised you in Jesus Christ. So until then, God bless you, and signing off.